So we're talking about seeing things from Hashem's point of view, and I gave an example yesterday of how one might do that. Now I want to make a sort of introductory remark to the whole idea. Maybe I should have said this yesterday. I have had people in this shir say to me the following idea. I just can't believe that the creator of the universe, at last estimate, 10 to the 22 stars, that's a 1 with 22 zeros, that the creator of the universe cares whether or not I eat snails. That he cares about my diet. I just can't imagine that. I can't believe that. And my response to that comment is, I believe you. I believe you can't imagine it. But what conclusion do you draw from the fact that you can't imagine it? Do you think you ought to be able to imagine it? Why do you think you ought to be able to figure out what the creator of the universe wants you to do? Shouldn't you assume that it's so different, he's so foreign to our understanding and reality, that if it was up to me to figure it out, I would just give up and say, I'll live with a blank. The only way you could possibly know what the creator of the universe wants you to do is what? Is if he tells you. And he told us. So, surprise, surprise, he is interested in our diet. It's not an objection. So, once you have an example like that in mind, you draw back and you think, how am I going to know what the creator of the universe wants? It's not because it's intuitive to me, it feels right to me, it agrees with my intuitions. No. Either he tells me or it's a blank. So, and we have a whole history based on prophecy, one event of national prophecy, and then of very, very many individual prophets. Our traditions tell us that in 1,000 years from the Exodus to the beginning of the Second Temple, there were 1,200,000 Jewish prophets. 600,000 men and 600,000 women. It's 1,000 years of continuous prophecy. Every Jew who lived in that period of time knew prophets, talked to them, interacted with them. So that's where this tradition of what God wants is coming from. And that's why I was saying yesterday that when you are confronting any circumstance in life, and you want to deal with it in a realistic way, that would be dealing with it from the point of view that God takes in managing it. You have to find out how it looks to him. Now, I want to give you a couple of more examples of the kinds of things that people think and feel, and then to ask how it would look from a Kodesh Baruch Hu's point of view. What about getting tests of the health and the genetic condition of a fetus in order to determine whether or not to abort the fetus? I don't have to tell you that this is universal, except in our community, it's universal. Indeed, one of my daughters was pregnant, and they did preliminary blood tests and found out that she had CMV. And that usually means the baby will have CMV, and that could lead to all sorts of birth defects later. So when the blood test came back, they called her in and said, we'll arrange for an abortion for you. And she said, no, you won't. No, you won't. I'm not doing that. What do you mean you're not doing that? I mean, the baby could have terrible defects. Yeah, it could have, and could not have. You know how they cheat with headlines? We have evidence that there could be a terrible disaster in 2060. Okay, but I would recommend, if I were the editor of the newspaper, whenever you say could be, just put in parentheses, could be or could not be. Because when you say could be, that includes could not be. If it doesn't happen, you can't say he lied. And then when you hear couldn't or could not be, okay, how seriously should I take that? And then when the baby was born, and the baby, Baruch Hashem, was perfectly normal, and has a 6-month checkup, you go to the health clinic with a 6-month checkup, and the nurse is going through the records. It says, CMV. Why didn't you abort the fetus? And my daughter said, we decided that we would wait to see he was born and see if we liked him. And then if we didn't like him, we could kill him then. Kill him then? Well, how can you say that? And she says, yeah. And if he's inside, it's okay to kill him? And of course, the health professional didn't have anything to say back. Okay, but now, how does this look? So, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Bracha, was alive when this technique was just beginning to become available, and he was asked about it. And he has a long response about it. I'm not going to the legalities of the response, but he makes a remark there, which I think is very telling. He says, when you decide that because of this and this defect, and these influences on the development and capabilities of the child, that you're going to abort the fetus, you're decided that life isn't worth living. How are you making that decision? That life isn't worth living? What criteria do you have? Where are you coming from? Let's take an extreme case, progeria, where the child prematurely ages and could die by the age of 20, having physically gone through like a whole lifetime by the age of 20. How tragic, you say. Okay, how tragic, you say. But does that mean it's a life not worth living? Let me tell you, I have a friend who has a granddaughter. She can only move her eyes. All her senses are okay and her mind's okay, but she's totally incapable of movement. She runs a business, a fashion business, and she lectures to hundreds of people. And she communicates by moving the cursor. The cursor reads where her eye is, and she moves the cursor around. And she says she's full of joy. Kadosh Baruch Hu gave her the opportunity to study, to learn, to understand, to communicate with other people. If you had known, if such a person would have known that the fetus would have that condition that could only move its eyes, they would surely have aborted. And let's say that the person suffers. Who says that a life that has suffering in it isn't worth living? So, Rav Moshe goes on to say, from our point of view, a life is a career of a soul. And you're deciding on what basis that it's not worth it for that soul to come into the world with that body. Well, the criteria you're using are the criteria of what you enjoy doing and how bad you would feel if you couldn't do them, and what kind of emotional state that would put you in, and how much suffering that would be. But maybe that's not all there is to life. I'll give you a little hint. If you've ever played sports seriously, I don't mean professionally, but seriously, you know there's no such thing as sport without pain. Are all the people who do sports masochists? They hate themselves? They cause themselves pain because somehow they have this terrible psychological disorder? Not really. You play football, you crash into people, and you get cuts, and sometimes you break bones, because the game is worth it. And frankly, you don't say, oh, the pain is terrible. I'm suffering with the pain, but it's worth it. I'll do it anyway, because I get more play. You just, I used to do sports, and you don't think about it that way. You just do the sport, you enjoy the sport, you take the pain you take it in your pace. You don't get unnerved by it. So the idea that you're making a decision whether the child should live or not, the fetus to develop into a child, is really something that only could be made from the point of view of the Creator, who set that child to come into the world in a certain condition and to live whatever kind of life that child could live. And that's part of the career of a soul. And especially when you take into account the idea of reincarnation, and yes, classical Judaism believes in reincarnation, and no, we didn't get it from India. India got it from us. We're older than what you have in India. And you look from birth to death, and you say, what kind of life is that? You have to imagine that you're reading one chapter out of a biography, Biography has 10 chapters. You're reading chapter 3. Well, you wouldn't judge the value of a life on 10% of its history, would you? So you're not getting the whole picture. This is one instance of this soul coming into the world to play a certain role, and it's going to play other roles, and the sum total of its significance and value depends upon all the roles together, which you don't see. So here again, it's an example of something which people face. People face these kinds of decisions, and they make the decisions, and if they don't take into account how it looks from a Kodesh Baruch Hu's point of view, in terms of the ultimate reality, they can be making terribly tragic decisions. Got a question? Right? Okay. That's that example. Now, there's another example. How do you decide what career you would like in life? What career you want to have for yourself? I think almost universally people test their strengths. You know, if you're a whiz at putting a medium-sized ball in a hoop and you can't hit a little ball into a hole, you don't try to become a golf professional, you go into basketball. You do the things that you're better at doing. You'll have a more successful life if you do that. Many people try to gerrymander their lives so that as much of the time as possible, they're living in terms of their greatest talents so they'll be more successful. And there's a certain logic in that. But I don't think that's the only logic. Let me give you an extreme example. That's the way philosophers work, to make a point. They take an extreme example so that the outcome will be obvious. Here's Peter. Now, Peter has two opportunities for a life career. First of all, he is a superb boxer. Probably could win a gold medal at boxing. He also could be a social worker. Not superb. With a grade scale, like an A- social worker. So he has one alternative where he'll win the top prize and he'll make a lot of money and his name will be in lights for out-punching the other guy. And if he becomes a social worker, he'll save people's marriages and he'll perhaps even stop people from committing suicide, and he'll save relationships, and there'll be hundreds of people whose lives were significantly improved by what he did. Is it obvious that he should become the boxer? Because that's his stronger talent? Might one not ask, in which career will he do more for the world? Will he make the world a better place? The boxing career or the social work career? And it might be that, although social work is his secondary capability, the contribution that living a life in terms of his secondary capability will be a much bigger contribution than living his life in terms of his primary capability. And then at least that idea should be a competitor for what he should do. Not saying that people should give up their own future and their own personal success wholly, shouldn't take it into account, but at least some question of what's being accomplished by what you do should be taken into account. And that certainly is the point of view that the Torah has on choosing a career. Yeah, question.
You think the Torah would tell him to be a social worker?
Absolutely. And not only the Torah. I think most people who would look at life in terms of what you could contribute to the world. In other words, people's psychologies vary, but in my experience, most people's psychology is mixed. We do have selfish concerns and selfish values, things that we think are important because they'll be good for ourselves. And we also have concerns for other people as well. So let me give you two examples of experiences where I want to bring out the fact that this is natural for person's psychology. And say the person's in a job situation and it's going to be a promotion and it's him or one of his co-workers, there's only going to be one, there's two candidates, and he's working to get it. So he works overtime and he puts a lot of thought into what he's doing and he cultivates the relationships which are important for corporate success, and the decision is made and he gets it. I think he feels a great deal of satisfaction, a great deal of happiness of that. Now imagine also that person's on the street and there are people walking and a child walks over and is going into the street to get a ball, and all of a sudden there's an out-of-control car racing down the street. If that child gets the ball, he's going to be dead. So this fellow, almost instinctually, grabs the child and pulls him out, and the car goes racing past, and he saves the child's life. Does he feel good about that? I think he does, because he saved a child's life. He's not getting any money out of that. Nobody filmed it. It's not going to go up. It's not going to go on his Facebook page. But he saved the child's life. I think we care about doing things that are valuable, that are good, that are improve the world. In fact, we also care about our own personal success. So now, if you ask the person, try to imagine you're now 20 and you're picking your career. Imagine you're 65 and you're about to retire, and you're looking back on your life and saying, yes, I made a good choice and I had a good life. Do you ask yourself, if I'm a superb boxer, and he'll have to retire at 32 with brain concussion, but okay. I had a wonderful life and I did things that I think I wanted to do, I feel like a success. Could very well be that he would say that more so if he was a social worker and saved people's marriages and saved people from suicides. Then if he won this fight and won that fight and got the Golden Gloves, and made $1 million punching people. And that being the case, I'm thinking even from a secular point of view, since people have both kinds of values, it isn't obvious that he should become the prize fighter. From a Torah's point of view, the key element is what kind of value you bring into the world. And I'll give you illustrations of that in a minute. But I'm saying, even before I get to the Torah's point of view, I think this is a natural question to ask. I don't think it's just from a religious point of view.
I was going to ask, after retirement that you mentioned, with all this money that we're assuming this boxer is going to make, we could potentially make the argument that we're either doing something that's going to be more self-fulfilling for that time, but after retirement, with the amount of money the boxer is going to have, to then do even more chesed potentially than the social worker. So
let me tell you a story. I think this actually happened. There was a fellow in a religious family, and he was 25 years old, and he was in yeshiva. And his father said, I have a proposition for you. I want you to come into the business with me, work with me in the business for 10 years, and after 10 years, I'll give you enough money so that you can retire at 35 and live the rest of your life learning Torah and doing things that you think are important. So he went to his Rosh Yeshiva and asked him, what should he do? And the Rosh Yeshiva said, your father is very smart, because he knows that after 10 years in the business, you won't want to retire. You won't want to go back to yeshiva. It'll change your character. It'll change your outlook. It'll change your instincts. I doubt very much that if a person has a prize-fighting career until 65 and looking forward to retirement, looking forward to doing chesed and helping people who are in need, hands over and so on, I doubt that very much. That's not typically the kind of character that kind of lifestyle provides. So the probability that he's going to do that, I think, is less. If from the beginning he dedicated himself to that and gave away 80% of his income during his lifetime, every fight he gave away 80% to yeshivas and so forth and so on, that would change it. I don't know if that would change, but then you're using the same criterion. The criterion is, how much good is he going to do for the world in terms of his lifetime? So what you're pointing out is that if you change the facts a little bit, you can get a different outcome. I agree. If you're using the same criterion, my point is only the criterion. Somebody else have a question? Yeah.
How much does enjoyment factor into it? Like, if he's a great social worker, great boxer, but he hates social work, or he really just doesn't like it, he loves boxing, would you say there's like a spectrum of how much he should enjoy? Because I assume if he hates it, he shouldn't do it.
This is a very, very interesting question. Ask which, in terms of take enjoyment into account. For number one, enjoyment should definitely be taken into account. But enjoyment comes in different shapes and sizes and flavors. Not all enjoyment is the same. And a great deal of enjoyment is satisfaction. And satisfaction means I have a desire for something, and it's the desire that gets satisfied. Not all enjoyment is a matter of satisfaction. When you are parents, you will have the delightful experience of feeding to your child the first time ice cream. And you'll see, typically this is what happens. You put the spoon with the ice cream to the child's lips. Well, it's cold. And it's an unfamiliar texture. And the child is cautious and wary. What are they doing to me? Until it gets to the taste buds. Bang! Hooked for life. Especially if it's vanilla. Hooked for life. And you see that, that response. Right? That pleasure is not the pleasure of satisfying a desire. The child had no desire for this beforehand. It just affected the nerve endings in such a way that he gets a pleasurable experience. But not all pleasure or enjoyment is like that. Some pleasure comes from satisfying a desire. And only from satisfying a desire. And I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that you're trying to influence your 12-year-old cousin to play chess. He knows how to play, but he's not very interested in it. So you said, let's play a game of chess. And your plan is to skillfully and convincingly lose the game. And so that he'll feel that he has some ability, and then maybe that will encourage him. So now, he makes the move and he says, uh-oh, my rook's gone. Now, you can't not take it because he saw already that he made a mistake. So you got to take it off. And then the imbalance in pieces becomes too great and you have to win the game. How much satisfaction or pleasure do you get from winning the game? 0. First of all, he's not up to your standard of play. Second, what you wanted to do was to lose. So there's certain times when the pleasure you get is a pleasure of satisfying a desire. Now, the question then becomes, what kinds of desires do you have? What flavors do they come in? Well, you do have desires for pleasure. You do have desires for sort of selfish gains, but you also have desires for good things to happen in the world. That's why the guy who saves the life of the child gets a tremendous pleasure out of it. Gets a pleasure out of it because he did something good. He did something valuable. And that also gives pleasure. I doubt very much that the person would be a candidate for social work if he didn't think that he was doing something valuable. If he thinks he's doing something valuable, he will get pleasure from it. And pleasures come in various, John Stuart Mill pointed this out, and we agree with him, they come in various levels. Some are more important, less, but it's a long story. I think enjoyment is an important issue, and I think that it will automatically play a role on both sides of the Yes, there are different types of joy, different things. In fact, just to put a footnote in, and I've checked this with the literature, pleasure is a very, very difficult concept because when you think of the tremendous variety of things that you get pleasure from, it's very hard to pick out what they have in common. You can get pleasure from an ice cream cone, you get pleasure from Beethoven's music, you get pleasure from a beautiful mathematical proof, you can get pleasure from overcoming a bad habit. I mean, these have very little in common. Very, very difficult to say what it is in common that justifies saying that they're all pleasurable or all pleasant. So that's an unsolved problem. I looked up the philosophical literature. It's an unsolved problem. I think probably there's something deep going on there. Philosophy just hasn't found it, but then it's hard to reason with, hard to wrestle with. So now, let me give you a really practical example. I started to become religious in college, and I came to Eretz Israel for a year to be in yeshiva after I got my BA. I was introduced to Talmudic learning. Now, not only is Talmudic learning very difficult, but for me it was especially difficult. First of all, I'm very bad at languages, and you're really dealing with two different languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. I didn't like text. I'm a thinker. I like to think. Indeed, when I took advanced mathematics, when they stated a theorem, and this the teacher encouraged us to do, don't look at the proof in the book, try to prove it on your own. And then he would have us present our attempts to prove it in class, and he would either certify them or point out the mistakes. And we were up to the late hours of the night talking on the telephone, maybe you could do it this way, maybe you could do it that way. It was a tremendous challenge. I developed the attitude that if you have to memorize it, it isn't worth knowing. That's stupid. But that's the attitude that I developed. Okay, now you come to Jewish learning. Well, how much you know and remember is very important. And you're dealing with texts in these foreign languages all the time. And then the type of Talmudic study for someone trained in math, in philosophy, my field was philosophy and mathematics. Mathematical thinking and mathematical creativity is extremely different from Talmudic study. Extremely different. In mathematics, you start with axioms. You assume the axioms and nothing else, and everything else has to be proved from the axioms. And the axioms are given to you at the start. You have a few primitive ideas, and everything has to be defined. The whole system starts with primitive propositions called axioms and primitive ideas from which everything is defined. And then there on out, everything has to be defined and proved. The Talmud doesn't work that way at all. I was in a shir once, learning Dovid, and they talked about the two different types of prohibitions. Chefs and gavra, the case where the prohibition falls on the person, or the case where the prohibition falls on the item. And the person teaching it was a professor of mathematics at Harvard. Well, that was a from guy. So I said to him, how do you define those concepts? And he said, we don't, and just kept going. I thought, what? You're using concepts you don't define? It took me years to realize that studying the Talmud is much, much more like studying the natural world and trying to explain it. When you do science, you don't start with the basic concepts. You hope to end with the basic concept. You start with phenomena in front of you, and it's a blooming, buzzing confusion, and you have all sorts of results, and some of them are definite, and some of them are only probabilistic, and you're trying to make sense out of it. And you're trying to create concepts as you go along to make sense out of it. It's a great, ultimate theoretical achievement to arrive at concepts that work. Newton did it for his time. His concept turned out to be false. It's too bad. Einstein corrected them. Maybe Einstein's are false too. It's a problem of quantum mechanics. But you don't start that way. You discover the laws of nature. You don't start by assuming them and prove theorems. It's a very different mental set. So for me, Talmudic learning was a big challenge. It was foreign to my nature of thinking, and it was needing abilities that were poor on my side. I simply could have said, so forget it. Like, well, I'm doing okay. Going back to get a PhD in philosophy, in particular philosophy of mathematics. I got the PhD and became a professor, but the Torah tells us that studying Talmud is very important. Very important. So I devoted a great deal of time to it. Broke my head over it, broke my teeth on it. I got to the point where I can understand fairly well. That's much more important than going on to do more spectacular things in philosophy. Why? Because this is the tradition that expresses the information God projected into the world so that we'll know how things look to Him, so that we'll live lives in terms of how things look to Him. And those are going to be the lives that are ultimately spiritually successful lives. That's much more important than discovering new things in philosophy. It's just more important. There was a student who came in here. He was in medical school. He became an ophthalmologist. And very bright guy. He was going to a very good school. And we came to him, and he got married, had a couple of kids. And then he called me up, and he said, I have some terrible confession to make, and I hope you won't despise me for it. I said, oh, I think he's running guns for the Palestinians. What is he doing? What could be so terrible? And he said, I've given up my life's dream of winning the Nobel Prize in medicine. I said, yeah, why did you do that? And he said, well, I have 2 children. My wife's pregnant with a 3rd child. And I have to be a father for this family. And one thing a father has to be is scholarly. That's one of the roles the father is supposed to play. His children will go to school. Am I going to be the father who can't answer his 7-year-old's question on the text that he's learning? That's not right. I said, congratulations. You made the right decision. Not only the probability of winning the Nobel Prize is 0.00001%, but he made the right decision in terms of values. It's much more important. So if you appreciate the idea that what makes your life a success is the importance of what you accomplish, then when you know that the the criteria for what are important are the criteria of the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at the world. You look at it differently. When I was on my explorations, my mother was a lawyer, and she had a hope that I would go into law. I thought to myself, I'm picturing my epitaph. Here's my tombstone, and here's the epitaph. He tried 642 cases in court. He wrote 1,974 contracts. That's his life. I thought, no, it isn't. That's not a life. That's not a life. It's a career, but it's not a life. You know, you don't live to work. You work to live. When they say time is money, that's a terrible lie. Time is life. Don't trade life for money. Use money to enable yourself to have a life. And a life of court appearances and contracts, that to me wasn't a life. So these are the kinds of meditations which I think people who aren't religious can understand. And I'm pointing out that the idea of looking at things from God's point of view, that's something which helps inform this kind of meditation, this kind of decision. Yeah.
How does the concept of tzedakah fit into this? Say you have someone who's day trading and he's getting to a point where he's just making millions of dollars and he's giving a ton to the community, but obviously he's gaining absolutely nothing with what he's actually doing.
So this is very tricky. I wouldn't agree with the last words. This is very tricky, though. It's a very tricky question. He's not gaining nothing. He's doing a mitzvah, so that's gaining something.
I mean, there's no values in day trading, in terms of what.
Oh, in terms of what he's okay, but a lot of life is creating them, using means to get to ends.
Right.
So when you walk to the store and buy the sefer and bring it home before you open it up, what did you learn on the way? Nothing, but you needed it home, right? Mm-hmm. So you shouldn't despise means. People have this prejudice. Some things are valuable in and of themselves, intrinsically valuable. Some things are only means to other things. Only, and that's only is natural. That's only a means, right? Okay. I strongly recommend that you don't stop breathing. Isn't breathing a means? You don't live to breathe. You breathe to live. But keep breathing. Because it's very important, right? One shouldn't despise means. A means can be extremely important, and certain ends are trivial. So I gave him a dime. So what? So it's not means and ends. So now, this question is discussed. I can't give you details because we depend upon too many. I mean, exact answer. But this question is raised. I can make so much money in every hour of work. I can support 20 people learning. So if you tell me to take off 2 hours or 3 hours, 60 people aren't going to learn. Okay. But if I spend all my time making money and giving it to other people learning, I won't learn. What should I do? And the answer is there has to be a balance. You cannot give up entirely your learning in order to support more people learning. Some of the personal mitzvah has to be done. How much? I can't give you any answers to that because that depends upon many more circumstances would have to be filled in. But simply enabling others, just enabling others, isn't a satisfactory Jewish life. Now, how you calculate this, the Torah has rules for calculating this. Yeah.
So I know because in the written Torah and the oral Torah, Hashem essentially projected the truth for us to study, and that's why we study Talmud. But because, from my understanding, Hashem also projected His truth into the natural world, right, like nature. But I know there's also truth in everything as well. So how much do we owe it to Hashem and to ourselves to study natural sciences, or even just any condition, like a human condition, if you want to be a psychologist, or do we owe it as much importance as we do studying Talmud?
You're asking a very good question, and the literature on the question is a little bit controversial. So I haven't mastered all the literature on it, but one view, which may be an extreme view, is the Maharal, who's the greatest authorities, and his Yeshivat Torah, I think it's around chapter 20. He says the following: we make a blessing on someone who has mastered secular knowledge. And the blessing is Asher Nosan Mechachmaso Labasav Adam. God gave him from God's own wisdom to flesh and blood. Maral says, think about that blessing. Meditate on it a little bit. We make a blessing on the guy, this guy who knows chemistry, because God gave him some godly wisdom. Could it possibly be wrong to study chemistry? We make a blessing on somebody who's mastered it? If it were wrong, we'd never make a blessing on that. So he said, and not only that, but there's a statement in Pirkei Avos, which he quotes and repeats. You should know what to answer people who are skeptics or heretics. And he says it's a responsibility. And that means you should not only study chemistry, but you should study their works so as to be able to answer them. And when you're doing that, you're doing a very precious mitzvah. And if you're successful in doing that, you'll sit at the very high place in the world to come. So, you're not studying chemistry for chemistry's sake. You're studying chemistry. Let me add one more thing here, because I made a mistake on this for many years, and so did one of my teachers make a mistake about this. The Rambam says that the way to come to love God is to study his works and see the wisdom in his works. And when you do that, you'll see that wisdom, and then you'll want to know him and want to draw close to him, and so forth and so on. So for a long time, I read it wrong. I read study his works. Okay, that's nature, like you said, which is correct. That's absolutely correct. So I'll study nature, and then by studying nature, I'll come to want to grow close to God. So as Rabbi Meisel, my teacher, said, he thought the same thing. Gee, there are a lot of scientists who don't develop that. They study nature and they don't want to come close to God. Never occurs to them. So what is the Rambam talking about? As often happens, we were just reading the Rambam wrong. He says, study his works. That means study it as his works. The Rambam is not writing for an atheist. The Rambam is saying, you know there's a creator. How do you relate to the creator? What's your attitude towards the creator? Well, if you study his works as his works, these are the things he made. Now look at the enormous wisdom, enormous complexity, enormous subtlety that's packed into the world. That's an example of his handiwork. Then you want to get to know the one who performed that handiwork.
Like looking at a painting, knowing some painting.
Exactly, like looking at a painting and then wanting to see other paintings by the same painter and want to read books about his style and understand what his style is better, because there's an agent behind it that you want to relate to. That's exactly the idea that's going on here. So if you study it as his handiwork, and then you study it in such a way as to serve him by studying his handiwork, then it's definitely a positive value. The Maharal uses the words mitzvah and chov, both, for this. But the bottom line is what you said also. You don't compare it to the study of Talmud. You don't compare it to the study of Talmud. So it means, to say that the value of A is greater than the value of B, it doesn't follow that you do only A. That doesn't follow. Because B may be necessary for certain things. So it's a question of relative allocation of time and resources for one or the other. One of the scholars of the 19th century, he lived into the 20th century, had a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in his home. That's reputed to be the greatest and also most difficult work of philosophy of the last 300 years. Right? He had it in his home, and it was clear that he spent some time reading it. He had it in the bathroom. We're not allowed to think thoughts of Torah, so what did you do? So he's reading it. He wasn't reading a comic book, and he wasn't reading ancient Chinese history. He was reading philosophy. The Ramah studied philosophy, and the Marshal criticized him bitterly for it. And Ramah said, because he quoted the Rambam on philosophy, and the Ritva did more than that. The Rambam read the Greeks himself. He says so because when he argues with the Ramban, he says, I'll tell you what the Greeks said about it. So there definitely were people who did this because they felt that either understanding the Torah or understanding how to respond to heretics was a way of serving God. And you also mentioned, quite correctly, that if you do it in order to earn a living, then many would agree. If you're doing it to earn a living, why should you earn a living pushing a plow when you can earn a living being an accountant? When you study accountancy, you're not studying Talmud. You're studying the laws of the country that you live in and certain mathematical techniques. That's definitely not Torah, but you're using it for the sake of your living. So all of those can make these studies appropriate. The Maharal may be considered to be a radical position, but the Maharal is certainly someone whose opinion is kosher. So I can't deny that. Okay, that's that. Now there was another example I wanted to give you. Maybe I'll have time today to start it anyway, and then we'll see how far we get. Here's a piece of Kantian philosophy. What are my obligations? What are the things that I ought to do? Well, said Kant, there's one principle, and that is, you only have an obligation to do something that you're able to do. The slogan became, ought implies can. To say that somebody ought to do something is based on the assumption that he can do it. And intuitively the feeling is, suppose somebody says to me, you ought to do X. And I say, well, I just can't. You ought to give a lecture in Shanghai in Chinese. Really? Sorry, maybe you have a mistaken impression of me, but I don't speak Chinese, so I couldn't do that. So then what happens to the ought? It does feel like the ought is vacant. It's as if some mistake has been made in saying that I ought to do something which I can't do. But the fact is that that's not obviously true, and there's an alternative. And philosophers have talked about this. It's not me that's making this up. One of the intuitions we have is, somebody says to me, you ought to do X, and I don't do X, then I'm in for blame. I didn't do what I ought to do. So then I'm in a wrong position. I'm subject to criticism. When I say, but I couldn't, that cancels out the criticism. It cancels out the failure. That, I think, is rock solid. You can't criticize me for omitting something which I couldn't have done. But it doesn't automatically follow that I don't have the obligation. It could be, I have the obligation, but my failure to fulfill it isn't blameworthy because I couldn't have fulfilled it. So you say, how about you playing with words? What difference does it make whether you say you could have or you couldn't have? What difference does it make? The bottom line is, you're not guilty. Well, I'll show you the difference. Reuven borrowed money, and he has to pay it back in a year. He borrowed money, he owned a house, and he has a good job, and he makes profit. He just happened to need the money to use it on occasion. And then 6 months later, things started to go wrong. His house burned down, and the insurance company went broke, so he didn't get paid for it. And then he has an elderly parent, and the parent needs his help and needs his monetary support. And downsizing at the company he works for. Comes the end of the year, he hasn't got the money. Okay, he borrowed money. The year's up, the contract says he's got to pay it, and he hasn't got the money. What would Kant say? Well, Kant would say, he can't pay it. Since he can't pay it, he has no obligation to pay it. Because you can only have an obligation to do what you're able to do. And he can't do it. So he has no obligation to pay it. That's what Kant would say. The alternative to say is, yes, he has an obligation to pay it. He signed the contract is due. But we don't blame him for not paying it. We don't accuse him, we don't criticize him because we see that he can't do it. Now, what would be the difference? And when you start learning Gemara, you'll see that when you have a different conception, they always ask, what's the nafkamina? Meaning, in what practical case would it make a difference? Here's the difference. Should I lend Reuven money so he can pay off the debt? Would that be a good thing for me to do? Well, let's see. If he has no obligation to pay, like Kant says, what would I be accomplishing by giving him the money? Right now, In the world, everything's morally perfect. There are no deficiencies. Nothing's left hanging. There are no unpaid bills. There are no unfulfilled responsibilities. Why should I give him the money? But if you say it the second way, where he really owes it, and he really ought to pay it, he just can't, then when I give him the money, I'm enabling him to fulfill the responsibility. That's a moral gain. The world is a better place now that he can fulfill the responsibility that he has. Now the Torah is absolutely clear that when somebody has a mitzvah to do and hasn't got the means to do it, then other people are obligated to help him by giving him the means to do it. Which means that the Kantian picture is wrong, and the second picture that I told you is right. And this makes a big difference when you think about the Torah. Am I obligated right now to do every mitzvah in the Torah perfectly? So naturally, I can't do that. Yeah, you can't do that, but so what? That doesn't cancel out the obligation. It means that if I fail to do what I ought to do, I won't be held responsible for the failure. I won't be criticized. I won't be penalized for the failure. Doesn't mean I don't have the obligation. The obligation is there. So you have to live with that sort of two-dimensional mind. The obligation is there, but room and understanding is given if I don't fulfill it entirely, because I'm not able to. That's a big difference in the way you think about it. See, some people say like this: the only thing you can be obligated to do is do your best, because that's all you have control over. You can't be obligated to do something you have no control over, and according to what I'm telling you now, that's wrong. You can be obligated to do what you don't have control over. You just don't get criticized. There are no penalties for not doing more than you have control over, because you don't have any more control than that. And one of the differences is helping other people fulfill the obligations that they can't fulfill. That's a quite different attitude towards life and towards obligations. Question?
So if there's no actual penalty for not doing it, but the obligation's still there, then how is it beneficial to know this idea, to know that my obligation's still there, but
Well, for one thing, I know that idea about you. So now I'm motivated to help you fulfill those obligations that you can't fulfill.
no, just for me?
Well, I mean, but why would that matter? I know it about you, and you know it about other people. This will inform the relationships between people. It's valuable for everyone to know this idea, number one. Number two, this would be a matter of psychology. Somebody says to me, no, it's okay, doesn't matter, you don't have to do it. Then I sort of relax. Should I be motivated to create new resources for myself so as to be able to do the things that I am not able to do? If you tell me I have no obligation to do them, I don't hear the moral push to actually work on getting to that position. But if I'm told that I do have the obligation, I'm just excused because I don't have the ability, then I hear it would be important for me to try to get the ability. So I think it would have an effect even on the individual person. But it's important enough to know that that's the way you relate to other people. Yeah.
When you gave your example earlier of Peter, the boxer, the social worker,
Yeah.
were we assuming that Peter was from, the one from guy ever named Peter?
I didn't assume one either way, and he picked me up on that, rightly so. If he were from, it might make a difference. I wasn't thinking of his, giving away 80% of his income on the spot, which I think would be more realistic than just saying when he retires at 65, and that would be definitely a benefit for the community. So you have three cases. You have the boxer who just boxes and then buys a yacht when he retires. You have the boxer who gives a lot of money to charity, and you have the social worker. But my point is only the criterion. I don't care how the cases come out. My point is the criterion, and the criterion would be that the pure boxer is living a life of relatively small value. What is he doing? Providing entertainment for people that degrades their character. Who threw the bigger punch? How fast did he knock him out? Did he break his jaw? Yeah, he broke his jaw. Is that really making the world a better place? People watch that and think, oh, that was a great fight. He really killed him. I could never, even when I wasn't from yet, I could never watch boxing. It was just gross. two intelligent people behaving like animals. And more than that, Rav Shach has an essay on this. They say, but they're much smarter than animals, they're much smarter strategies than animals. That's right. They're smarter, and you have smarter strategies for doing something utterly degraded. Thank you very much. That makes it worse. That doesn't make it better. You're using the human intellect, human creativity to beat somebody up. Thanks a lot. Okay, these are more examples of the same idea from a Kodesh Baruch Hu's point of view.